A poor mother cleans a downtown restaurant on Christmas Eve while her daughter sleeps on a booth. The billionaire owner sees it and does the unthinkable. The silence of the empty restaurant felt heavier on Christmas Eve. James crossed the main dining area for the last time that night, his steps echoing against the dark wood floor. The tables were already cleared, the chairs arranged, the lights dimmed to the necessary minimum. Everything in place, everything as it should be. He checked the thermostat on the wall, set the alarm system, confirmed the windows were locked. The usual routine, nothing special, just another day ending, even if it was Christmas Eve. Outside, thin snow fell onto the deserted streets. The surrounding storefronts glowed with colorful lights and festive decorations. Families hurried past, carrying bags and wrapped gifts. Distant laughter, lively conversations, the kind of noise James had learned to ignore. Inside the restaurant, however, silence reigned. He liked it that way. He preferred it that way. James grabbed his coat hanging behind the counter and took one last look around. The restaurant was his refuge, the only place where it still made sense to exist. Here, everything followed an order. Everything had a function. That's when he heard the noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It came from the back of the dining area, near the service area. James frowned. He should be alone. The doors were locked. The staff had left hours ago. He walked slowly toward the sound, circling the empty tables. The faint light from the kitchen barely illuminated that part of the restaurant. And then he saw it. In the furthest corner of the dining room, next to the exposed brick wall, Grace was crouched beside one of the upholstered booths. She held a damp cloth and meticulously wiped the floor with slow, methodical movements. The cleaning cart was next to her, products neatly organized. Grace was always like that, discreet, efficient, invisible. James knew her by sight. She had worked cleaning the restaurant for a few months, always arriving after everyone had left, always leaving before anyone returned. They exchanged few words, a greeting here, a thank you there, nothing more. But that night, something was different. On the bench where Grace was working, a child was sleeping. She was a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, blonde, with light hair falling over her face, bundled up in a coat that was too big for her. Grace's coat, James realized. The girl was huddled up, her small legs bent, her arms crossed over her chest. She was deeply asleep. Grace looked up and saw James standing there, watching. She straightened up quickly, with an almost defensive movement. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, her voice calm but strained. "I had no one to leave her with today. I promise she won't be in the way." "I'm almost done." James didn't answer immediately. He stood there, looking at the scene, at the woman who worked in silence, trying not to make a noise, at the child sleeping on a restaurant booth on Christmas Eve. "It's all right," James said, his voice coming out huskier than normal. "Take your time finishing up." Grace nodded, surprised. She returned to work, but James noticed her movements became even more careful. He should have left. He should have grabbed his coat, locked the door, and headed home. That's what he did every night. But tonight, something kept him there. James walked over to the counter and stood, pretending to check some papers, but his eyes kept returning to the back of the room. To the woman who cleaned, to the child who slept. Grace finished cleaning the floor and began putting the products back in the cart. She looked at her daughter, checked that the coat was properly tucked around her, that the girl was comfortable. And it was at that moment that the child stirred. The girl turned onto her side, her face furrowed, her lips moving. Grace quickly approached, knelt beside the bench and placed a hand on her daughter's forehead. "Shh, my love," she whispered. "Sleep. We'll be going home soon." But the girl continued to stir, restless. Her eyes opened slightly, glazed, confused. She looked at Grace with that lost expression of someone who just woke up. "Mommy." "I'm here, Chloe." "Sleep a little longer." But Chloe did not go back to sleep. Instead, she sat up on the bench, rubbing her eyes with closed fists. She looked around, trying to orient herself. The empty restaurant, the dim lights, her mother kneeling beside her. And then she said, "Can we stay here for Christmas?" Grace froze. Her eyes widened. Can Chloe? No, can we, Mummy? The girl insisted, her voice echoing in the empty room. It's warm here. Grace looked around, desperate. James was still there, across the room. He had heard everything. Chloe, sweetie, we don't have food at home. The words came out in a shout. It wasn't anger. It was just a fact. A truth spoken without filter, without shame, without understanding the weight it carried. The silence that followed was absolute. Grace closed her eyes, her head bowed. A single tear rolled down her face, but she quickly wiped it away. Chloe remained seated on the bench, swinging her little legs, not understanding why her mother was so quiet. And across the room, James had stopped completely. The papers fell from his hand. He stood there, motionless, the girl's words echoing in his head. We don't have food at home. He looked at Grace, at the woman who worked in silence, who never asked for anything, at the blonde-haired, light-eyed child who had spoken those words so naturally, and something inside him broke. James knew that silence. He knew that hidden shame. He knew the burden of not having enough. He dropped everything. He turned, and without saying a word, he walked toward the kitchen. Grace lifted her head when she heard the footsteps moving away. She watched James disappear through the kitchen door and stood there, confused. Chloe yawned and leaned against her mother's shoulder. Did I say something wrong, Mommy? Grace hugged her daughter. No, my love. You didn't do anything wrong. In the kitchen, James turned on all the lights. The room exploded with brightness. He walked to the industrial refrigerator and opened it, his eyes scanning the shelves. Roast chicken, vegetables, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, butter, leftovers, food that would be thrown away or forgotten until it spoiled. But for someone, it was everything. James grabbed the containers and placed them on the counter. He turned on the oven, adjusted the temperature, and put the portions onto deep plates. He worked quickly, precisely. He prepared 3 plates. He paused for a second when he picked up the third one, but he continued. He heated everything thoroughly. He added bread and butter. He filled 3 glasses with cold water. He arranged everything on a tray. It was not an elaborate feast. There were no decorations, there was no special dessert, but it was food. Warm food. Real food. James picked up the tray and returned to the dining area. Grace was still next to her daughter. When they saw James approaching with the tray, Grace immediately stood up, her eyes wide. Sir, I can't— If you haven't had dinner yet, James interrupted, his voice firm but low. I can serve something. He placed the tray on the nearest table. The 3 plates were steaming. The smell of the food filled the room. Grace looked at the food, at James, at the 3 plates. I can't accept this. You can, James said. It wasn't charity. It was simply the right thing to do. Grace hesitated. She looked at Chloe, whose eyes were already fixed on the plates, shining with anticipation. And then, with a subtle nod, Grace accepted. Thank you, she whispered. James nodded and helped Grace seat Chloe in the chair. He himself pulled up a chair and sat at the table. Grace looked at him, surprised. Are you going to— Yes, James said, if you don't mind. Grace shook her head. No, of course not. She sat down too, adjusted Chloe's napkin and handed the girl her fork. The 3 of them sat there, around that simple table, in the middle of an empty restaurant on Christmas Eve. Chloe looked at the plate as if it were treasure. Can I eat, Mommy? You can, my love. Chloe took the first bite. She chewed slowly. She closed her eyes. And she smiled. It's so good. Grace also began to eat, but her hands were trembling slightly. It wasn't just food. It was dignity. It was relief. James ate in silence, watching the 2 of them. He hadn't sat at a table with other people in years. He hadn't shared a meal. And somehow it didn't feel so bad. Chloe couldn't stay quiet for long. Between bites, she began to talk. This chicken is really tasty. Mommy, there's so much mash. Can I eat it all? Grace smiled, wiped her daughter's mouth, and answered softly. But her eyes were shining. Chloe looked at James with those clear eyes full of curiosity. What's your name? James. I'm Chloe, she announced. And this is my mommy, Grace. Grace flushed slightly. She's very talkative. I apologize. No need to apologize, James said, and there was a slight smile at the corner of his mouth. Chloe continued eating, but she didn't stop asking questions. Dad, you make food every day? Yes. That must be cool. Sometimes. Do you have a family? Grace touched her daughter's arm, a little embarrassed. Chloe, but James shook his head. It's all right. He paused for a moment. No, I live alone. Oh, Chloe said thoughtfully, it must be too quiet. James almost smiled. It is. The conversation flowed. Chloe told stories about things she saw on the street, about neighbors, about a cat that appeared in their backyard. Grace listened, corrected some details, and smiled. And James listened too. He answered when asked something. He smiled when Chloe said something funny without forcing it. It just happened. There was something warm about it. Something that filled the empty restaurant. When the plates were almost empty, Chloe rested her chin on her hand and looked at James. Do you have a Christmas tree at your house? The question hit James like a punch. He stopped. He breathed. No, he said, his voice calm but distant. I don't usually celebrate. Chloe thought about that for a moment. And then she said, but you're here with us now, doesn't that count as celebrating? James was speechless. Grace looked at her daughter, then at James. There was understanding in her gaze. James swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, I guess it does. Chloe smiled, satisfied, and returned to eating. The subject changed. The conversation continued. Grace talked about how difficult life had been lately, but that things would get better. Chloe talked about the drawings she made, her dolls, the dreams she had, and James stayed there, participating, listening, being a part of it. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone on Christmas Eve. For the first time in 3 years, the silence inside him didn't hurt so much. When everyone finished, Chloe yawned loudly. I'm sleepy again. Grace looked at the clock. It's past your bedtime, my love. She started to get up, gathering things, but James raised his hand. Leave it. I'll clean that up later. Sir, I can't. Grace, James interrupted, and there was a gentleness in his voice. It's fine. Grace didn't know what to say. She stood there, holding her daughter's hand, her eyes shining. James helped Chloe put on her coat, adjusted the beanie on her head. The girl looked at him and smiled. Thank you for the food, James. It was the best Christmas dinner I've ever had. James felt something tighten in his chest. He crouched down to be at her height. You're welcome, Chloe. The girl hugged him, just like that, without warning. She simply threw her little arms around his neck and squeezed. James froze for a second, and then, slowly, he returned the hug. Grace watched, her eyes moist. When Chloe let go, James stood up. He looked at Grace. She extended her hand. Thank you, James, for everything. He shook her hand. It was my pleasure. And it was true. Grace and Chloe walked toward the door. James accompanied them, unlocked it, and held the door open. The snow was still falling outside, heavier now. Be careful on your way, James said. We'll be fine, Grace replied. Merry Christmas, James. Merry Christmas, he said back, and this time it didn't hurt so much. Chloe waved as they walked away, holding her mother's hand, the two small figures disappearing into the snow. James stood in the doorway for a long time, watching until they were completely gone. Then he closed the door, locked it, and went back inside. The room was empty again, silent again, but something had changed. The table was still set, with the 3 empty plates. The chairs were still pulled out. James walked over to the table and stood looking at it. 3 plates, 3 people. A simple meal on Christmas Eve. And inside him, something that had been dead for a long time began to stir, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. It was hope. James carefully gathered the plates, took them to the kitchen, and washed each one. He put everything away. He turned off the lights. He grabbed his coat. And when he left the restaurant that night, for the first time in years, he wasn't completely alone. Because something had been planted, something he didn't expect. It was the beginning of something none of the three of them imagined. And Christmas, for the first time in a long time, hadn't been just pain. It had been good. The front door of the house closed behind James with a soft click. He stood in the entryway for a moment, his hand still on the doorknob, his eyes scanning the room. Everything exactly as he had left it, everything in place, everything clean, everything silent. The house was small but comfortable, simple furniture, white walls, well-maintained wood floor. There wasn't much decoration, only the essentials. James never cared much about that. Decoration was for homes full of life, full of people. His was just a place to sleep. He took off his coat and hung it on the rack next to the door. He took off his shoes and left them organized underneath. He walked to the living room, crossed the narrow corridor, and entered the kitchen. It was a small kitchen, but well-equipped. Granite countertop, 4-burner stove, new refrigerator. James spent little time there. He usually ate at the restaurant or brought home prepared food. Cooking at home seemed unnecessary when he spent all day doing it at work. But tonight, he wanted something warm, something simple. James turned on the light above the sink. The gentle brightness filled the kitchen, reflecting off the clean surfaces. He grabbed the kettle, filled it with tap water, and placed it on the stove. He lit the low flame and stood there, watching. The water would start to heat up in a few minutes. He was in no hurry. While waiting, James got a mug from the cupboard. It was a simple white mug, no patterns. He put a tea bag inside, chamomile. He always drank chamomile tea at night. It helped him sleep, or at least it used to help. In recent years, sleeping had become more difficult. No matter how tired he was, no matter how late it was. There was always that moment lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when the memories came back, when the silence became too heavy. James looked out the kitchen window. The snow was still falling outside, covering the small backyard with a white blanket. The trees looked like ghosts, their bare branches extended towards the dark sky. It was beautiful, in a way, but it was also lonely. The kettle began to whistle. James turned off the stove and poured the hot water into the mug. Steam rose, carrying the soft aroma of chamomile. He watched the tea infuse, the colors mixing in the water. He carefully picked up the mug and walked to the small round table in the corner of the kitchen. It was a table for 2 people. He always sat in the same chair. The other one remained empty. James sat down, placed the mug in front of him, and just sat there, alone. The house was completely silent. Not even the ticking of a clock, not even the hum of the refrigerator, just silence. But tonight, something was different. James noticed it as he held the warm mug in his hands. The silence was still there, but it didn't weigh the same way. It didn't squeeze his chest. It didn't make the air feel harder to breathe. It was just silence. He took a sip of the tea. It was warm, comforting. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth travel down his throat. And that's when the images came back. Not the usual images, not the memories that haunted him every night, not the accident, not the pain. They were other images. A blonde girl with bright eyes, sitting at the table of an empty restaurant, smiling as she ate. The sparkle in her eyes when she tasted the chicken, the way she swung her little legs in the chair, excited, full of life. "It's so good!" James could almost hear her voice, high-pitched, happy, without a care in the world beyond that moment. And then there was Grace. Her gaze, tired but strong, grateful but proud. She hadn't asked for anything, she hadn't begged, she just accepted what was offered with dignity. "Thank you, James, for everything." James opened his eyes and looked at the mug of tea. Steam was still rising, dancing in the air. He thought about the way Chloe had laughed. It wasn't a contained laugh. It wasn't shy. It was genuine, free, contagious. The kind of laugh that made you want to smile too, even if you didn't get the joke. When was the last time he had heard a child laugh like that? When was the last time he had truly smiled? James took another sip of tea, thoughtful. There was something about Chloe's innocence that touched him in a way he didn't expect. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know his story. She didn't know the pain he carried. To her, James was just a man who had made food, a man who had been kind, and maybe that was all that mattered. He thought about Grace too, the way she worked in silence without complaining, the way she cared for her daughter even when things were difficult. There was a strength in her, a resilience that James recognized, because he also had to be strong every day. He had to keep going, even when he didn't want to. He had to wake up, go to the restaurant, do the work, pretend everything was okay. But was everything okay? James looked around the kitchen, everything clean, everything organized, everything in place, but empty. Always empty. He had built that routine after the accident. Work, home, no variations, no surprises, no strong emotions. It was safer that way, less painful. But tonight, something had cracked that routine, something small, something simple. A child asking for food, a mother accepting help, a shared meal. And now, sitting alone in his kitchen, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was close to it. It was lightness, as if a weight he had carried for years had become a little lighter. It hadn't disappeared, it was still there, but it didn't press down so hard. James took another sip of tea and, without realizing it, smiled. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible, just a slight upward curve at the corners of his mouth, but it was there. He thought about how Chloe had asked if he had a Christmas tree, and how she had said that being with them counted as celebrating. But you're here with us now, doesn't that count as celebrating? Maybe she was right. Maybe celebrating wasn't about trees and gifts and decorations. Maybe it was just about being with someone, about sharing something, about not being completely alone. James finished his tea and placed the empty mug on the table. He sat there for a few more minutes, just thinking, not planning, not analyzing, just letting the thoughts flow. For the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't bother him. It didn't hurt. It was just silence. And maybe that was okay. Eventually, James stood up. He washed the mug, dried it, and put it away in the cupboard. He turned off the kitchen light. He walked down the hall to the bedroom. He changed his clothes, brushed his teeth, and lay down in bed. He stared at the ceiling as he always did, but the thoughts that came were not the usual ones. They were not painful memories. They were not unanswered questions. They were not the images that haunted him every night. They were different thoughts. Had Grace and Chloe made it home safely? Were they warm? Had Chloe managed to fall asleep? James caught himself thinking about these things, and he realized something surprising. He was worried about someone else, not in an agonizing way, not in a way that consumed him, but he was thinking about someone besides himself, and that somehow felt right. James closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, on Christmas Eve, he didn't feel completely lost. Something had shifted, something small but real, something he couldn't name but that he recognized. It was a beginning, a small beginning. And as sleep finally came, James smiled again, lightly, as if something deep down had finally come undone. Morning arrived clear and cold. James woke up earlier than usual, which was strange considering he had slept better than he expected. He got up, showered, and made coffee, the usual routine. But there was something different in the air, a restlessness he couldn't identify. While drinking his coffee, his thoughts returned to the night before, to Chloe and Grace, to the shared meal. To the little girl's smile. It was Christmas Day. Shops would still be open in the morning but would close early. James had no plans. He never had plans for Christmas. He usually stayed home, waiting for the day to pass. But that morning, something compelled him to leave. He finished his coffee, put on warm clothes, grabbed his coat, and went out. The streets were emptier than normal. The snow from the night before had stopped, but the ground was still covered in a white, glistening layer. Some families hurried along, carrying last-minute purchases. Children ran, excited about the arrival of Christmas. James walked with no specific destination for a few minutes, until he found himself standing in front of a toy store. The window was decorated with blinking lights, golden stars, and a small Christmas village. Inside, he could see shelves full of toys, stuffed animals, games. He hesitated. When was the last time he had entered a toy store? The memory came quickly, painfully, 3 years ago. Buying a gift for his daughter, the last gift she would ever receive. James took a deep breath. But then he thought of Chloe, her bright eyes shining as she ate, her genuine smile, her spontaneous hug, and he went inside. The store was warm, the air filled with the smell of new plastic and wrapping paper. Christmas music played softly over the speakers. Some parents walked the aisles, reviewing last-minute options. James walked slowly among the shelves, looking. There were so many options: electronic toys, board games, puzzles, cars, dolls. He stopped in front of a shelf full of them. There were all kinds, big, small, with elaborate clothes, with accessories. But it was a simple doll that caught his attention. It was small, the right size for a 6-year-old to hold. It had brown hair, painted eyes, and wore a simple blue dress. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. But there was something honest about that doll, something pure. James picked it up from the shelf and held it for a moment. He weighed it in his hands. He imagined Chloe holding that doll, playing with it, giving it a name. He decided. He took the doll to the cash register. He paid and asked for a bag. He didn't want them to wrap it at the store. He would do it at home, his own way. When he left the store, the sun was higher in the sky. James walked home with the bag in his hand, feeling something strange in his chest. It wasn't regret, it wasn't sadness. It was purpose. At home, James placed the doll on the living room table. He went to the closet where he stored some things and looked for wrapping paper. He found a roll of plain beige paper with no patterns. He also grabbed a subtle brown ribbon. He sat at the table and began to wrap. He wasn't good at it. He never had been, but he did it carefully. He measured the paper, cut it, folded the edges, taped it. He tied the brown ribbon around it, making a simple bow. When he finished, he looked at the wrapped gift. Simple, discreet, but made with care. James didn't know if he would see Chloe and Grace again. He didn't know if they would return to the restaurant, but if they did, he wanted to have something to give them. He put the gift in a drawer and went to take care of the rest of the day. It was late afternoon when James heard a knock on the restaurant door. He had gone there to check a few things, to make sure everything was in order. He wasn't expecting visitors. The restaurant was closed for the holiday, but when he looked through the window, he saw 2 familiar figures outside. Grace and Chloe. James felt something tighten in his chest. He quickly went to the door and opened it. "Hello," he said. "Hello, James," Grace replied, a little shyly. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're closed, but we wanted to stop by and thank you again for what you did yesterday." Chloe was next to her mother, holding something in her hands. When she saw James, her face lit up. "James!" He couldn't help but give a small smile. "Hi, Chloe. Come in," James said, opening the door wider. "It's cold." Grace and Chloe entered. The restaurant was darker than the night before, only a few lights on, but still welcoming. Chloe ran up to James and held out what she was holding. "I made this for you." It was a card, made of colored paper folded in half. On the front there was a drawing made with colored pencils, a green Christmas tree with red baubles, yellow stars all around, and 3 figures holding hands. James carefully took the card and opened it. Inside, in larger, shaky but legible letters, was written, "Happy Christmas, James," and underneath, another drawing, 2 adults and a child sitting at a table, all smiling. James stared at the card, unable to speak. "This is you," Chloe pointed to one of the figures, "and this is me, and this is Mommy." Grace stood beside them, watching with a gentle smile. "She wanted to make something special for you." James swallowed hard. He felt something rising in his throat. It's beautiful, Chloe," he managed to say, his voice rough. "Thank you." Chloe smiled, proud. "Did you really like it?" "I liked it very much." He looked at the card one more time, at the 3 of them drawn together, at the vivid colors, at the care a 6-year-old had put into it, and suddenly he remembered. "Wait a moment," James said. He went to the back of the restaurant where he had left his bag. He opened it and took out the wrapped gift he had brought from home, just in case. He returned and held it out to Chloe. "This is for you." Chloe looked at the wrapping, then at James, then at Grace, her eyes wide. "For me?" "For you." Grace put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Chloe, you don't have to." "Please," James gently interrupted. "I would like her to have it." Grace hesitated but nodded. Chloe took the gift with both hands, as if it was something precious. She looked at the plain paper, at the brown ribbon, and then carefully she began to unwrap it. The paper fell away, and the doll appeared. Chloe was completely still for a moment, just staring. Then her eyes filled with tears. "A doll," she whispered. Grace brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes shining too. Chloe held the doll to her chest and looked at James. "Thank you." And then, without warning, she threw herself into his arms. James froze. He felt her small arms around his neck, the girl's face pressed against his shoulder. She squeezed tightly, as if she would never let go. For a second, James didn't know what to do, but then, slowly, his arms moved. He hugged her back. Gently at first, then more firmly. And something inside him broke. Not painfully, but liberatingly. Grace watched everything, one hand over her heart, her eyes moist. There was gratitude there, but also something more. Recognition. Understanding. That gesture said more than any words could. Chloe finally let go and took a step back, still holding the doll. "I'm going to call her Bella," she announced. James smiled, truly smiled. "That's a beautiful name." Grace stepped closer and put her hand on James's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea how much this means." James shook his head. "It was nothing." "It was everything," Grace corrected. The three of them stood there for a moment, in the middle of the empty restaurant, surrounded by a comfortable silence, and James realized that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone on Christmas Day. He had given a gift, but he had received something much greater, something that couldn't be wrapped, something that couldn't be bought. He had received connection. He had received hope. And as Chloe hugged her new doll and Grace smiled with gratitude, James put the card in his pocket, very close to his heart. 2 days after Christmas, James was in the restaurant kitchen preparing the week's grocery order when he paused in the middle of the process. He stared at the list in his hands, but his thoughts were elsewhere. In a house he had never seen, with two people who, just a few days ago, were merely passing acquaintances. Grace had mentioned the address in passing when he offered help if she ever needed anything. She had politely declined, but James had stored the information anyway. And now, looking at the items on the list, an idea took shape. He grabbed a large bag and began setting aside a few things. Rice, beans, milk, fresh bread, fruit, eggs, butter, pasta, canned goods, nothing extravagant. Just the basics, the essentials. He filled 2 bags until they were heavy. He put everything in his car and drove to the address he had memorized. The neighborhood was modest. Small houses, some well-kept, others needing repairs. Narrow streets with accumulated snow on the sidewalks. Children played in some yards, enjoying what was left of the holidays. James found the number he was looking for and parked in front. It was a small 1-story house, with faded paint and a yard surrounded by a low iron fence. The gate was slightly crooked, as if it had been repaired several times, but there was something welcoming about it. Clean curtains in the windows, a small pot with dried flowers on the porch. James picked up the bags from the back seat and got out of the car. He was walking towards the gate when he heard the shout. "Fire James!" He turned his head and saw Chloe running from the side of the house, her blonde hair flying behind her, a coat too big covering her small body. She dashed across the yard and stopped on the other side of the gate, her eyes shining with joy. "You came!" James couldn't help but smile. "I did." Chloe tried to open the gate, but the latch was stuck. She pulled hard, making a grumpy face. "It's stuck again." James placed the bags on the ground and helped, lifting the gate slightly while pulling. The latch came loose, and the gate opened with a loud creak. Chloe immediately grabbed his hand. Come see my house." "Chloe, wait," James began, but the girl was already pulling him. Grace appeared at the front door, drying her hands on a dish towel. When she saw James, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. James?" "Hello, Grace," he said, slightly awkward, picking up the bags again. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I brought some things." He pointed to the bags in his hands. Grace walked down the porch steps and approached, looking inside one of them. Her expression changed completely. Surprise, gratitude, and something else James couldn't quite identify. "James, you didn't have to do this." "I know," he gently interrupted, "but I wanted to." Grace opened her mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. She looked at the full bags, then at James, then at Chloe holding his hand. And then her voice choked with emotion. She said, "You have a very kind heart." James looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. He remained silent for a second, feeling the weight of the words, trying to find his own. "Maybe," he started, his voice low and hesitant. "Maybe you reminded me of something I had forgotten." Grace held one of the bags with both hands, her eyes shining. She didn't say anything more, but she didn't need to. Everything was there, in that look. Chloe pulled James's hand again, impatient. "Are you coming in? Do you want to see my room? I left Bella sitting on the bed." "Chloe," Grace said softly. "Mr. James must be busy." "No," James said, surprised by his own answer. "I'm not busy." Grace looked surprised too, but then she smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her tired face. "Then please, come in. It's not much, but it's our home." "I'm sure it's lovely," James said. He followed the two inside, carrying the bags. The house was small, as he had imagined. The living room was cramped, with an old but clean sofa, a low table with some scratches, a small television in one corner. The walls had a few marks, the paint peeling in some places, revealing old layers, but it was tidy, organized. There was love there, despite the lack of resources. There were Chloe's drawings taped to the wall, flowers in makeshift cups. A blanket neatly folded over the sofa. "Sit down, please," Grace said, pointing to the sofa as she took the bags to the kitchen. "I'll put these away and make some tea. You don't have to go to any trouble." "It's no trouble," Grace insisted, already disappearing through the narrow door leading to the kitchen. "No, it's the least I can do." Chloe sat next to James on the sofa, hugging the doll he had given her. The doll's blue dress was a little crumpled but well cared for. "Bella sleeps with me every night," she announced, proud, clutching the doll to her chest. "Does she really?" "She does. And she likes you very much." "I told her you're my friend." James felt something tighten in his chest. "I'm happy to hear that." Chloe suddenly jumped off the sofa as if she had a brilliant idea. "Do you want to play?" "Play? Restaurant? You can be the customer and I'm the chef just like you." James hesitated. When was the last time he had played? When had he sat on the floor and pretended anything with a child? Years. It had been years, but looking at Chloe, with those bright eyes full of expectation and enthusiasm, he couldn't refuse. "All right." "Really?" Chloe shouted, jumping for joy. "Come on, sit here on the floor." She pointed to a space on the floor near the low table. James got up from the sofa and carefully settled himself on the floor. His legs complained a little. He wasn't used to that, but he managed to sit reasonably comfortably. Chloe ran to a corner and came back with a cardboard box full of toys, plastic pots and pans, small plates, cups, pretend food made of colorful plastic. "Here is the menu," she said solemnly, handing him a piece of scribbled paper. James held the paper carefully, pretending to read seriously. Lots of good options here. What would you like? What do you recommend?" Chloe thought for a moment, serious as a true chef. "The spaghetti is very good." "I make it better than Mommy." From the kitchen, Grace laughed out loud. "And that's true, unfortunately. I even burn water." James smiled, relaxing a little. "Then I'll have the spaghetti, please." "Great choice." Chloe grabbed a small pan and began pretending to cook, making sizzling sounds and stirring with a toy wooden spoon. Her movements were exaggerated, theatrical, completely absorbed in the game. James sat there watching. There was something surreal about it all. Him, a man in his 40s, sitting on the floor of a house that wasn't his, playing make-believe with a child he barely knew. And yet it felt right. It felt natural. Grace returned from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and stopped at the living room entrance. She stood there for a moment, just watching. James was sitting on the floor, a little awkward with his legs crossed, but genuinely smiling as Chloe served spaghetti on a small pink plastic plate. There was something about that man, something held back, something deep that she perceived but couldn't completely name. He was kind, quiet, thoughtful, careful with every word, but there was a sadness in his eyes, an old pain that he carried like an invisible weight, always present, never mentioned. Grace didn't ask. It wasn't her business, but she saw and she felt, and somehow she understood. "Done," Chloe announced triumphantly, placing the plastic plate in front of James. "The best spaghetti in the world." James picked up the toy fork and pretended to eat, making sounds of approval. Delicious. It's perfect. You're a very talented chef." Chloe laughed, satisfied, her cheeks flushed with pride. Grace placed the cups on the low table and sat on the sofa, watching the 2 of them play. There was something warm about that scene, something she hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling that she wasn't completely alone in the world, the feeling that someone cared. After that day, James started showing up more often, not every day, not intrusively or smotheringly, but regularly. A week later, he returned with fresh loaves of bread wrapped in paper, leftovers at the restaurant, he said, although Grace suspected that wasn't exactly true. A few days later, he arrived with an old toolbox. "I noticed the kitchen faucet was dripping. Can I take a look?" Grace accepted, grateful. James fixed not only the faucet, but also the gate that kept getting stuck, a window that wouldn't close properly, and a loose outlet on the living room wall. Chloe was always by his side, watching every move, asking 1,000 questions, talking non-stop. "Why do you use that tool? Does that hurt if it touches your finger? Can you fix my doll?" "Her arm is loose." James answered with infinite patience. He explained the processes, he taught, he showed, and slowly, without realizing it, he began to feel needed again. He began to feel useful. One evening, when James was about to leave, Chloe came running with a worn book in her hands. "Can you read to me?" James looked at Grace, who was in the kitchen finishing the dishes. She nodded with a warm smile. So he sat on the sofa, Chloe snuggled up next to him as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and James began to read. It was a children's book about a princess and a dragon who became friends. James hadn't read to a child in years. His voice was hoarse at first, uncertain, stumbling over some words, but soon he found the rhythm. Chloe listened with total attention, her eyes fixed on the colorful illustrations, her head resting on his shoulder, breathing softly. Grace watched from the kitchen, drying the dishes with automatic movements, her heart tight in a way she couldn't explain. There was something deeply moving about that scene, a man who carried so much visible pain in his eyes, but who could still be gentle. He could still care. He could still give love. She didn't know what had happened to him. She didn't know the full story, but she saw the way he looked at Chloe, with genuine affection, but also with deep longing, as if he remembered someone, as if he were reliving something lost. When James finished the book, Chloe was almost asleep, her eyes heavy. "One more," she murmured sleepily. "I think it's bedtime," Grace said gently, approaching. "Come on, my love," Chloe grumbled, but obeyed. She gave James a long hug before leaving. "Thank you for the story. You read very well." "You're welcome, Chloe." "Sleep tight." Grace took her daughter to the small room in the back. When she returned a few minutes later, James was standing, ready to leave, his toolbox in hand. "Thank you," Grace said, and there was so much weight in that word. For everything. For the food, for the repairs, for the stories, for being here. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," Grace insisted, taking a step closer. "You can't imagine how much this means to us. How much you mean." James remained silent for a long moment. Then, softly, with rare vulnerability, he said, "I don't think you realize how much it means to me either." Grace looked at him, truly looked, and something passed between them. A silent understanding, a connection that needed no words. Both were alone. Both carried things too heavy. But together, in some mysterious way, the weight was lighter. "You're always welcome here, James," Grace said firmly. "Always." He nodded, touched. "Thank you." And when he left that night, walking across the small yard to the gate that now opened smoothly, James realized something fundamental. He wasn't bothered by the sound of that house, by the constant conversations, by the laughter, by the childish mess, by the life happening in every corner. On the contrary, he felt at peace there. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. And as he drove back to his own silent, organized house, James smiled to himself in the dark, because he had found something he thought he had lost forever. He had found a place where he belonged, a place where he was expected, a place that felt like home. The afternoon was clear and cold. James had arrived just over an hour ago, bringing a few things Grace had mentioned needing. Nothing major, just small daily items, a bag of rice, some fresh fruit, bread still warm from the restaurant. Now Chloe was sitting in the backyard, at a small, colorful plastic table that Grace had placed near the porch. The girl had spread colored pencils, markers, and sheets of paper all over the surface, completely absorbed in what she was doing. James was sitting in an old wooden chair next to her, just observing in silence. Chloe drew with her tongue sticking out, focused, her blonde hair falling over her face, her bright eyes intensely focused on the paper. There was something mesmerizing about watching a child so lost in creativity, so present in the moment, without worries about yesterday or tomorrow, just existing now. "What are you drawing?" James asked after a while. "A house," Chloe replied without lifting her eyes from the paper, "with a big garden and lots of colorful flowers. And a really tall tree." "That sounds beautiful." "It is. It will have red, yellow, pink flowers, all the colors there are." She made a wide gesture with her arm. "And the tree will be so big that you can climb it." James smiled slightly. "Do you like climbing trees?" "I've never climbed one," Chloe admitted, stopping drawing for a moment to look at him. "Yeah, but I think I'd like it very much. It looks fun." "It is fun," James said, the memory coming clearly. "When I was a kid, I had a big tree in the backyard. I spent hours up there." Chloe stared at him with genuine curiosity. "You were a kid? Like, small like me?" James laughed. A genuine laugh. "Yes, believe it or not, I was a child once too." "That's funny," Chloe said thoughtfully, returning to her drawing. "It's hard to imagine adults being small." "Is it?" "It is. You're all so big and serious all the time." James thought about that. When had he stopped being just big and serious? When had all the lightness of life gone away? He knew the answer. He knew exactly when. "Can you help me color?" Chloe asked. James hesitated for just a second. "Of course." Chloe pushed some colored pencils towards him and pointed to a part of the drawing. "You can color the flowers here. I'll do the house and the tree." James picked up a red pencil and began to color carefully, trying not to go outside the lines. He hadn't done that in years. Decades, probably. But there was something deeply comforting in the simple movements. The sound of the pencil sliding softly over the paper, the required concentration, the absence of heavy thoughts. They stayed like that for a long time, side by side, coloring in comfortable silence. Only the sound of the pencils, the gentle wind rustling the trees, and the distant chirping of some bird. Inside the house, through the kitchen window, Grace watched while washing dishes. There was something deeply touching about that scene. James, so tall and strong, hunched over a child's table, coloring flowers. Chloe next to him, completely comfortable with his presence. It was an image that made Grace's heart tighten in a good way. Suddenly, without warning, Chloe dropped the green pencil and looked at James, her eyes shining with pure excitement. Mommy said that if we can afford it, next year I'll go to a real school. James froze completely. His hand stopped in the middle of a stroke. The pencil remained suspended over the paper, trembling slightly. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stood there, completely motionless. Chloe didn't notice anything. She continued talking excitedly. I've never been to a real school, only at home, with Mommy teaching me. She teaches me letters and numbers and how to read, but she said maybe next year I can go with other kids. I'll have friends and a teacher and a uniform and a backpack and a lunchbox. James swallowed hard. He felt something squeeze violently in his chest. He tried to find words. He tried to organize the thoughts that were suddenly completely jumbled. In the kitchen, Grace had heard everything. She had seen his reaction through the window, the way he had frozen. She stopped what she was doing, her hands wet in the sink, her heart racing. She shouldn't have said that. Not yet. Not that way. But Chloe was a child. Children say things without thinking, without understanding the weight that certain words can carry. Grace pretended not to have heard. She returned to washing the dishes, making noise with the plates, but her ears were completely alert. James finally managed to move his hand. He placed the pencil on the table with extreme care. He took a deep breath once, twice, and then, his voice low, carefully controlled, he said, "You're going to love school." Chloe smiled widely. "You really think so?" "I'm absolutely sure. I'll learn to read big books, and do difficult math, and write stories, and draw even better." She paused thoughtfully. Mommy said she still needs to save money, but she will. She always does. James nodded slowly, unable to trust his own voice. "And can you pick me up from school sometimes?" Chloe asked. "Mommy works late some days." James felt his throat tighten. "If your mother allows it, I'd love to." "Yay!" Chloe clapped her hands and returned to her drawing, humming softly, already forgetting the conversation. But James stared at the paper without really seeing anything. His mind was elsewhere, in another time, in another similar conversation. "Daddy, next year I'm going to second grade." His daughter's voice echoed in his memory, clear, happy, full of life. "I'll learn new things and make more friends. The teacher said I'm really good at math." James closed his eyes for a second, breathing deeply, fighting the wave of emotion. Next year. But there had been no next year, not for her. There had been no second grade. There had been nothing else. When he opened his eyes, Chloe was still drawing peacefully, and James held on to that sentence, those innocent words spoken with so much hope. "If we can afford it, next year I'll go to a real school." If we can afford it. He held on to it as if it were a silent request, as if it were a promise he needed to make. As if it were too important to forget, because it was, because this time he could do something. This time he wasn't too late. This time there was time. Dinner was quiet, but there was a subtle tension in the air. Grace had made a simple stew with the ingredients James had brought during the week. They ate together, the three of them around the small table, talking about everyday things. Chloe talked about the neighbor's cat. Grace complained about the cold. James listened, participated when necessary, but he was quieter than normal. More distant, Grace noticed. But she didn't say anything in front of Chloe. After dinner, Chloe yawned loudly. "Someone needs to sleep," Grace said with a smile, getting up from the table. "I'm not sleepy," Chloe protested, yawning again. "Of course not," Grace agreed, picking up her daughter. "Come on, sleepyhead." Chloe snuggled into her mother's lap. She waved to James. "Good night, James. Thank you for coloring the flowers with me." "Good night, Chloe." "It was my pleasure." Grace took the girl to the bedroom. James heard her voice singing softly, the gentle lullaby, sounds of movement, of covers being tucked in, of good-night kisses, and then silence. Grace returned a few minutes later. "She was out before I even finished the song," she said with a tired smile. She was exhausted. She played a lot today. "She did." Grace grabbed 2 mugs and filled them with hot tea. "Shall we go outside? It's cold, but I have a blanket." James nodded. They went out to the small porch in front of the house. There were 2 old wooden chairs and a small table between them. Grace grabbed a thick blanket and draped it over James's shoulders before sitting down. The sky was clear. Stars shone intensely. The air was chilly, but not uncomfortable if you were bundled up. They sat in silence for a while, just drinking tea, looking at the empty street. Grace watched James from the corner of her eye. He was tense, visibly tense, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched. Something was different about him since the afternoon, since the conversation with Chloe. She knew what it was. She had heard everything. Finally, Grace decided to speak. She placed her mug on the small table and turned to him. "You have a sad look," she said gently, without judgment. James didn't answer immediately. He continued staring straight ahead, at the dark street. Grace waited. She didn't pressure him. She just stayed there, present. And then, after a long silence, James took a deep breath. He lifted his eyes to the sky, to the stars, and he spoke. "It's been 3 years." His voice came out hoarse, heavy. 2 days before Christmas?" Grace said nothing. She just listened. "My wife and daughter." James paused. The words were difficult. "They died in an accident." The air seemed to grow heavier. "I had stayed late at the restaurant. End of the year. A lot of work. They went shopping. Christmas presents, food." He paused again, swallowing hard. It was snowing. Hard. The roads were dangerous. Grace felt her eyes sting, but she didn't interrupt. A truck lost control. It skidded, hit their car. The words were coming out now in a painful flow. "They died instantly. It was fast," they said. "They didn't feel any pain," they said. He let out a bitter laugh, as if that made a difference. Grace couldn't hold back. A tear rolled down her face. "Since then, I just kept existing," James said, his voice breaking. "I get up. I go to the restaurant. I work. I go home. I sleep. Repeat. I don't live. I just exist." He finally looked at Grace, and she saw all the pain, all the guilt, all the weight. "I should have gone with them. I should have closed the restaurant earlier. I should have insisted they leave the shopping for the next day. James, I should have saved them," he said, and now the tears were flowing. "It was my job to protect them, and I failed." Grace didn't think. She just acted. She stood up, approached him and held his hand, firm, warm, real. James looked at her hand over his, and he didn't pull away. For the first time in 3 years, he accepted comfort. "It wasn't your fault," Grace said firmly. "You couldn't have known. You couldn't have stopped it. But it wasn't your fault," she repeated, even more firmly. James closed his eyes. The tears continued to fall, years of pain, years of guilt, years of loneliness, everything pouring out. And this time he wasn't alone. Grace squeezed his hand tighter. She stayed there beside him, sharing that moment. "My daughter was 6 years old," James said softly, "the same age as Chloe." Grace felt her heart ache. She loved to draw. She loved to sing. She loved to ask questions about everything. "Like Chloe," Grace whispered. "Like Chloe," James agreed, opening his eyes. That's why it hurts so much sometimes. And that's why it's so good other times." He looked at Grace, vulnerable. "When I look at Chloe, I remember my daughter. And it hurts. It hurts a lot. But it also heals. Somehow." Grace nodded, understanding. "Jiaxi reminds you that there is still life, that there is still love." Yes, they stayed like that for a long time, hands held, sharing pain, sharing understanding. The night was cold, but there was warmth between them. "When Chloe said she might go to school next year," James began hesitantly, I thought that you could do something you couldn't do for your daughter," Grace completed softly. James nodded. "You can," Grace said, "if you want to, but not out of guilt. Out of love." James looked at her. Something different shone in his eyes now. Hope. "I want to help," he said. "Not to make up for what I lost, but because I care." "I know," Grace said, smiling despite the tears, "and we care about you too." James squeezed her hand back. and for the first time since he started talking, he smiled. Small, fragile, but genuine. "Thank you," he whispered, "for listening, for understanding, for being here." "Always," Grace promised. And there, on that small porch, under a sky full of stars, two lonely people found comfort. They found understanding. They found hope. James was no longer alone with his pain, and Grace was no longer alone with her struggles. They had each other. They had Chloe. They had a family that was forming. And as the tea cooled in the forgotten mugs, as the night advanced, as the world continued to turn, there was something precious there. There was connection. There was healing. There was love. And for the first time in 3 years, James felt that maybe he could live again. Not just exist, but truly live. The days that followed that conversation on the porch seemed different, lighter. As if something heavy had been set down after being carried for too long, James started showing up more often at the small house. Not every day, but almost. He brought things. He always brought something: fresh bread, fruit. Sometimes a simple toy he saw in a store that he thought Chloe would like. He fixed whatever needed fixing: the creaking kitchen door, the burnt-out bathroom light bulb, the leak under the sink. Small things that made a difference. But more importantly than that, he was present, simply present. Grace noticed the change in him, the way his shoulders seemed less tense. How his smile came more easily. How his eyes, previously always distant and lost, were now more here, more present. And Chloe simply accepted him as part of her routine, with that naturalness only children have. James was someone who was there, someone who played with her, someone who read stories, someone she could trust. It was as simple as that. One quiet January afternoon, James was sitting on the sofa in the small living room. Chloe was on the floor, spread out with her colored pencils and a pile of papers, coloring another drawing. This time, it was a large yellow sun surrounded by blue clouds. Grace was in the kitchen preparing tea, but the door was open and she could hear everything. The silence was comfortable. Only the sound of the pencils on the paper, the occasional sound of Chloe humming softly, the cold wind rattling the window. James watched the girl draw. There was something meditative about it, something that calmed his mind in a way he didn't expect. After a while he spoke, not to Chloe but to Grace, knowing she was listening. "I thought being alone was easier." Grace stopped what she was doing in the kitchen. She stood quietly, attentive. James continued, his voice low but firm. "Less pain, less risk. If you don't get close to anyone, you don't lose anyone again." Chloe continued drawing, oblivious to the conversation, lost in her own world. "I built a routine. Work, home, work, home. Nothing more. I thought that was enough. I thought that's what I deserved." Grace appeared at the kitchen door, drying her hands on a cloth. She looked at James with that gentle attention she always had. He looked back at her. "But being here, with you," James paused, searching for the right words. "Janet gave me a Christmas I hadn't had in years." Grace felt something tighten in her chest, but it was good. It was warm. "A child's joy changes everything," James said, looking at Chloe, who was now painting a cloud very carefully. "The way she sees the world, how everything is new, how everything is possible." He turned his eyes back to Grace. "You reminded me that it's still worth it, that there's still a reason to wake up in the morning, that there is still life." Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply smiled, that gentle smile, full of understanding, that said more than 1,000 words could say. And between them, at that moment, the silence was not empty. It was not uncomfortable. It was not heavy. It was a silence of belonging. It was the silence of those who understand, of those who accept, of those who are together. James felt something settle inside him. Something that had been displaced for a long time was finally finding its place. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just visiting. He wasn't passing through. He belonged there, in that small house, with that strong woman, with that child full of life. He had found a place to stay. Chloe held up the drawing, proud. "Done. Look how pretty it is." It was a huge, bright yellow sun with blue clouds around it and a rainbow crossing the paper sky. "It's beautiful," James said sincerely. "It's for you," Chloe announced, holding out the paper. "For you to put in your house and remember me when you're there." James took the drawing carefully, as if it was something precious. "Thank you, Chloe. I will treasure it." "Promise?" "I promise." Chloe smiled, satisfied, and picked up another piece of paper, already starting a new drawing. Grace approached and sat next to James on the sofa. They stayed there side by side, watching Chloe draw. They didn't need to talk. They didn't need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. It was okay like this. It was complete like this. James looked around the small living room, the peeling walls, the old furniture, the old TV. Nothing was perfect. Nothing was luxurious, but it was home. It was more home than his own house had been for the past 3 years. Because home is not about the place. It's about the people. It's about the connection. It's about belonging. And there, in that humble house, James finally belonged. Grace lightly leaned her shoulder against his. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. But it meant everything. It meant, "You are welcome here." It meant, "You are a part of this." It meant, "You have a place." James reciprocated, leaning slightly too. And they stayed like that, the two of them on the sofa, watching Chloe draw, while the tea cooled in the kitchen and the world outside remained cold and difficult. But inside there was warmth, there was peace, there was family. And for the first time in a long time, James didn't feel afraid of the future. He didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness. He didn't feel like he was just passing the days waiting for them to end. He felt that he was living, truly. And that, he realized, was everything. It was more than enough. It was all he needed. A place to stay, people to be with, a reason to keep going. And as Chloe hummed softly, drawing her next colorful sun, James closed his eyes for a moment and simply gave thanks. He gave thanks for that Christmas Eve when everything began. He gave thanks for not having left when he could have. He gave thanks for having the courage to come back. He gave thanks for Grace and Chloe letting him in. He gave thanks for being there, at that moment, in that place, alive, present, belonging. And when he opened his eyes again, Grace was looking at him, and she smiled, and he smiled back, and they didn't need to say anything else, because everything had already been said. In the silence, in the belonging, in the love that was growing there, silent but real, between 3 people that life had brought together unexpectedly, a family that no one planned, but that was becoming the most real of all. A week after that quiet afternoon, James invited Grace to come to the restaurant. It wasn't operating hours. The place was closed, only a few lights on, creating a welcoming atmosphere. Grace had left Chloe with the neighbor for a few hours, thinking James wanted to talk about something serious, and he was right. They sat at one of the tables near the large window. The street outside was empty, only a few cars passing occasionally. James seemed nervous, which was rare. He fiddled with his hands, looked at the table, straightened the napkin, and took a deep breath. Grace waited patiently, without pressuring him. Finally, he spoke. "I have a proposal for you." Grace tilted her head, curious. "What kind of proposal?" "A job, here at the restaurant." James looked directly at her now. "Not just cleaning. I need someone trustworthy to help with various things, managing inventory, serving customers, organizing orders. You would be essential." Grace blinked, surprised. "James, I don't know if—" "It would be a permanent job," he continued, the words coming out faster. "With better, flexible hours. You could work during the day or at night, as you prefer. We'll adjust it according to your needs. A fair salary well above what you earn now. Benefits. Everything proper. Registered." Grace remained silent, processing. James continued, seeing the hesitation on her face. "You wouldn't have to work 3, 4 different jobs. You wouldn't have to exhaust yourself every day. You wouldn't have to sleep 3 hours a night. You could have time with Chloe, time for yourself. You could have stability, security. Grace looked down at her own hands on the table. She wanted to say yes. She really did. But something held her back. "I don't want to depend on anyone," she said softly but firmly. James understood immediately. It wasn't empty pride. It was self-preservation. It was the fear of being vulnerable, of owing something, of losing autonomy. He leaned forward, looking directly into her eyes. "It's not charity," James said firmly. "It's not pity. It's not a favor." Grace stared at him. "It's trust," he continued. "I trust you. I trust your work, your ethics, your ability. You are one of the most hard-working people I have ever met, and it's a choice, your choice. You can accept or refuse, but know that I am not offering this out of pity. I am offering it because I genuinely need someone like this, and you are the right person." Grace felt her eyes sting. No one had spoken to her that way in a long time. No one had recognized her worth like that. "What about Chloe?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Chloe can come when she needs to," James replied without hesitation. "There's a back room. We can set it up with some things. Table, chair, toys, books. It can be a safe space for her to draw, play while you work. It's not perfect, but it's better than leaving her alone." Grace felt something break inside her. But it was a good break. It was a wall falling down. It was a defense that no longer needed to be there. She looked at James, at that man who had entered her life unexpectedly, who had seen her difficulty and hadn't looked away, who had offered help without demanding anything in return, and she saw sincerity, she saw respect, she saw true friendship. "All right," Grace finally said, her voice choked but clear. "I accept." James smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. "Really? Really?" Grace wiped away a tear that had fallen. "Thank you, James, for trusting me, for seeing me as more than just someone who cleans floors. You've always been much more than that," James said simply. "I'm just acknowledging the obvious," Grace laughed, despite the tears. "When do I start?" "Whenever you want. Next week. You can gradually phase out your other jobs." "Next week is perfect." They stayed there longer, talking about practical details, hours, duties, salary, everything transparent, everything fair. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt something she had forgotten. Security. Not just financial, but emotional. The feeling that someone valued her, that she had a place, that she mattered. It was liberating. A few days later, James prepared something special. It was late afternoon when he called Grace and asked her and Chloe to come to the restaurant. He said he had a surprise. Grace went curious. Chloe was excited, jumping up and down with anticipation. When they arrived, the restaurant was closed to the public, but the lights were on. Soft music was playing, and in the center of the dining area, a table was set for 3. Simple but beautiful tableware, steaming hot food, folded napkins, shining glasses. Even simple flowers in a small vase in the center. Chloe's eyes widened. "Is it a party?" "Something like that," James said, smiling. "It's a celebration. Your mother accepted to work here with me. So we're celebrating." Chloe screamed with joy and began running around the empty room, her arms open. Grace followed her daughter with her eyes, laughing. "Be careful not to knock anything over," she cautioned, without real scolding. James watched Chloe run, the way she laughed, how she moved with complete freedom, how she lived every moment with intensity, and he felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't pain, it was pure emotion. Grace approached him. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," James said. But I wanted to. I wanted to mark this moment." They sat at the table. Chloe stopped running and joined them, still breathless and smiling. The meal was simple but delicious. Perfectly seasoned roast chicken, fresh vegetables, creamy mash, warm bread. Nothing elaborate, but made with care. Chloe talked non-stop. She told stories, cracked jokes, laughed. Grace and James listened, participated, smiled. It was an ordinary scene, an ordinary meal. But there was something special there. It was family, not in the traditional sense, but in the real sense. People who cared, who supported each other, who chose to be together. When they finished eating, Chloe asked to explore the kitchen. James allowed it, as long as she didn't touch anything dangerous. The girl ran off as excited. Grace and James were left alone at the table. The silence was comfortable. Grace took the last sip of water. James looked out the window, thoughtful. Then he spoke, without looking at her. "I'm going to do for your daughter what I couldn't do for mine." Grace paused, the glass still in her hand. James continued, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "She is going to school, the best school we can manage. She will have a new uniform, complete supplies, everything she needs. Books, notebooks, backpack. She will have real opportunities. She will have extra classes if she wants. Sports, music, art." He turned and looked directly at Grace. "She will have everything I can offer, everything within my reach. I will secure her future. I will ensure she has chances, that she can be whatever she wants to be." Grace felt tears well up. She placed the glass on the table carefully, her hands trembling. "James, it's not to make up for what I lost," he hurried to say. "It's not about replacing my daughter. It's because I genuinely care, truly, about you, about Chloe, about your future. You have become important to me." Grace couldn't hold back the tears. They flowed freely as she reached out and held James's hand, firmly, tightly. "You've already started, James," she said, her voice choked but clear. "You are already doing all of this. You have already completely changed our lives. Since that Christmas Eve, since the first plate of food." James squeezed her hand back. He felt the weight of years beginning to lift. He felt that he was doing something right, something that mattered. "Thank you," Grace said, "for everything, for seeing us as people, for caring, for being here, present, for being part of our life." "Thank you," James responded, "for letting me in, for reminding me what it is to live, for giving me a reason to wake up, for giving me a family again." They stayed like that for a moment, hands held across the table in the silent restaurant with soft music in the background. There, at that simple table, something was being sealed. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't an obligation. It was a commitment to be present, to care, to build something together, to be family. James's past was honored. His wife and daughter would never be forgotten. They would always have a place in his heart, but the present was also taking shape, a present where he could love again, where he could make a difference, where he could be part of something bigger than his pain. Chloe came running back from the kitchen, her eyes shining. "There's a giant oven and huge pots hanging up. And a refrigerator the size of a room." Grace laughed, wiping away her tears. "Is that right?" "It is. Can I work here too when I grow up?" James smiled. "If you want to, of course." "I do. I'll be the best chef in the world." "I'm sure you will," James said. Chloe went back to running around the dining area, exploring every corner. Grace and James watched her, still holding hands. "She will have opportunities," Grace said softly. "Things I never had, thanks to you." "Thanks to us," James corrected. "Because I'm not doing this alone. I'm doing it with you. We're a team now." Grace smiled. A team. A family. And there it was. 3 people that life had brought together unexpectedly, forming something new, something strong, something real. James had lost his family. Grace had struggled alone for a long time. Chloe had grown up without many things, but now, together, they had everything they needed. They had each other. They had support. They had love. The music continued softly. Chloe continued exploring. Grace and James talked about plans, about the future, about possibilities, and for the first time in 3 years, the future didn't seem frightening to James. It seemed promising. It seemed full of life. It seemed worthwhile. He had found a new purpose, not to replace what he lost, but to honor it, to transform pain into something positive, to use his second chance in a way that mattered. And as he watched Chloe laugh and Grace smile, James knew he was on the right path. He was living again, not just existing, but truly living. And that was the greatest gift he could have received, the chance to start over, the chance to love again, the chance to make a difference. and he wasn't going to waste it. Not this time. This time, he was going to cherish every moment, every smile, every achievement, every day, because life had given him a second chance, and he was going to honor it, with everything he had, with all his heart, forever. There, that night, in the empty but life-filled restaurant, 3 people sealed a silent commitment to be together, to support each other, to be family, not on paper, not officially, but in what truly mattered, in the heart. And it was all they needed. It was more than enough. It was perfect the way it was. James looked around, at the restaurant that had been his refuge in solitude, at Grayson, who had become his partner, at Chloe, who had brought joy back, and he smiled. A full, genuine smile, full of gratitude, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just going through life, he was living, truly, and it was good. It was very good. 6 months later, the morning was clear and cold, typical of early spring. The sun was still low on the horizon when James parked the car in front of the small house. He didn't even need to honk. The door opened immediately, and Chloe came running out, an explosion of energy and excitement. "James! James! Look at my uniform!" She twirled in the yard, showing off her new school uniform. Impeccable white shirt, pleated navy blue skirt, white knee-high socks, shining black shoes, the new backpack on her back, still smelling of fresh school supplies. "You look wonderful," James said, and it was true. A true student. Chloe smiled from ear to ear. Her blonde hair was tied in 2 braids that Grace had carefully done. She looked older somehow, more grown up. Grace appeared at the door, a mug of hot coffee in her hand. She was wearing her restaurant uniform, ready for another day of work. But at that moment, she was just a mother, watching her daughter about to start a new chapter. "Are you sure you have everything?" Grace asked for the 3rd time. "I do." Chloe checked her backpack once more. "Notebooks, pencils, lunchbox, everything. And your coat." "It's right here, Mommy." Grace nodded, but her eyes were shining, contained emotion. James understood immediately. This was a big moment, a milestone, the kind of moment mothers cherish forever. "Shall we go?" Chloe asked, impatient. "I don't want to be late for the first day." "Let's go," James confirmed. Chloe ran to the car. James looked at Grace. They exchanged a silent look. Gratitude, understanding, partnership. "Thank you," Grace said softly. "For everything." "Always," James replied. Grace waved from the door as they got into the car. She stood there, watching, the coffee mug warming her cold hands, her heart aching in a good way. The drive to school was short, but Chloe didn't stop talking for a second. "Dad, you think I'll make friends on the first day? I'm sure you will. What if the teacher is really strict? She won't be. And even if she's a little serious, you'll get used to it. Do you think there's a playground?" "There is. I saw it when we went to enroll you." "Oh, right, I forgot." James smiled as he drove. Her excitement was contagious, pure. Without cynicism, without fear, just positive anticipation. When they arrived, the school was already busy. Parents dropping off children, uniformed kids running across the playground, teachers organizing the lines. James parked and accompanied Chloe to the gate. She held his hand, squeezing tightly. For the first time that morning, she seemed a little nervous. "It's going to be fine," James said gently, kneeling down to her height. "You're going to have fun. You'll learn new things. You'll meet friends." "Do you promise?" "I promise." Chloe hugged him, hard. James returned the hug, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest. But it was different now. It wasn't just pain. It was love, mixed with pride. "Go on," he said when she let go. "Show everyone how amazing you are." Chloe smiled, regaining her confidence. She waved and ran towards the other children. James stood there, watching until she disappeared inside the building. Then he walked slowly back to the car. Later that day, when James stopped by the house to pick up some documents Grace had prepared, he noticed something new on the refrigerator. Among the magnets, bills, and reminders, there was a new drawing by Chloe. He approached to get a better look. It was simple, done with colored pencils. 3 people holding hands, 2 larger ones, a small one in the middle. All smiling. Next to them, a large green tree. Above, a bright yellow sun with rays in all directions. James smiled. But then he noticed something written on the back. He carefully flipped the paper over. In large, neat, yet shaky letters, it read, "James, my friend who turned into family." He stood still, holding the drawing, reading and rereading those words. My friend who turned into family. Something moved inside him, something deep, something that had been frozen for a long time and was now finally, completely thawing. Grace walked into the kitchen and saw James standing there, holding the drawing. "She made it last night," Grace said softly. "She wanted to surprise you." James couldn't speak. He just nodded. Grace approached and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You know it's true, right? You are family, not on paper, but where it matters." James turned to look at her. His eyes were moist. "Thank you," he managed to say, "for letting me be a part of this, for letting me love you." "Thank you," Grace replied, "for seeing us, for choosing us, for being here." James folded the drawing with extreme care and put it in his shirt pocket, very close to his heart. Then he left the house, got into the car, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about everything that had happened, how it all started that Christmas Eve, how he was broken, empty, just existing, and he thought about how he was now. There was still pain. The grief for his wife and daughter would never completely disappear. There would always be difficult moments. There would always be dates that hurt. But now there was room for other things too. There was room for joy. There was room for hope. There was room for love. And he realized, sitting there in that car with Chloe's drawing in his pocket, that he was ready. Ready to move forward without guilt. Ready to build a new life without feeling like he was betraying the memory of the old one. Ready to be happy again. Not a happiness that erased the past, but a happiness that coexisted with it, that honored it. That transformed it into something with purpose. James started the car and began to drive, but this time he wasn't driving on autopilot. He wasn't just going from one place to another without thinking. He was present. He was conscious. He was alive. He looked out the window. The streets, the people, the sun shining. Everything seemed clearer, more colorful, more real. Life continued. It always would. And now, finally, James continued with it. Not backwards, not still, but forward, with Grace by his side as a partner and friend, with Chloe bringing joy every day, with a new family that no one had planned, but that was perfect the way it was. He smiled alone in the car, a complete smile, genuine, without weight, without guilt, just pure happiness. And as he drove through the city streets, James lightly touched the pocket where the drawing was kept. My friend who turned into family. Yes, he thought, exactly that. Family, not by blood, not by law, but by choice, by love, by presence. And that was more than enough. It was everything. Life had given him a second chance, and he had accepted it. He had embraced it. He had lived, and he would continue to live, every day, every moment, every smile. Because now he knew. He knew it was possible to carry the past without being crushed by it. He knew it was possible to love again without forgetting who was loved before. He knew it was possible to be happy even after losing everything. It wasn't easy. It never would be easy, but it was possible, and he was living proof of it. James parked in front of the restaurant, his work, his purpose. But now it was more than that. It was where Grace worked alongside him. It was where Chloe came to draw after school. It was where they had dinner together sometimes. It was home. He went inside, turned on the lights, and began to prepare for another day. But everything seemed different now. Lighter. More meaningful. Because he wasn't alone. Not anymore. And as he worked, James thought about the silent promise he had made. He would take care of them. He would be present. He would be the support they needed. not to replace what he had lost, but to honor it, to live, to love. And for the first time in 3 years, James was genuinely at peace.